And I prayed about it, and I thought, I'm not missing that dedication in Jerusalem without the airplane that we have that I bought from Tyler Perry.
For half a century, the name Kenneth Copeland has been almost synonymous with American televangelism itself. He built one of the largest prosperity gospel ministries on the planet, filled arenas, sold millions of books, and became a fixture on Christian television long before most preachers had ever touched a camera. But in the last few years, cracks have started to show in ways that are harder and harder to explain away. Health scares, quiet leadership shuffles, uncomfortable silences around family tragedy, and a mountain of unanswered financial questions have combined to make people wonder whether the empire Kenneth Copeland spent a lifetime building is finally starting to wobble. So what is actually going on inside Kenneth Copeland Ministries right now? Let's walk through it. In early May of 2024, Kenneth Copeland was rushed to the hospital with severe abdominal pain. Doctors discovered his appendix had ruptured, and he underwent emergency surgery, spending close to 2 weeks in and out of the hospital across 2 separate stays. On its own, that might read as an unremarkable medical emergency involving an elderly man. But context matters here. This is a preacher who has spent more than 50 years telling congregations that true faith removes the need for doctors, hospitals, or medicine altogether. A message that has shaped how millions of his followers think about their own health decisions. The timing made the moment sting even more. Just a year and a half earlier, on Christmas Eve of 2022, Copeland stood in front of his congregation and declared with total confidence that he would never catch COVID in any form, because he lived by faith. Less than 18 months later, he was on an operating table in Texas, while surgeons worked to stop an internal infection from spreading. When he eventually returned to the pulpit, Copeland handled the whole thing with a joke. He told his congregation that while he was under anesthesia, he'd been singing love songs to his wife Gloria and reciting verses out of Hebrews. The room laughed along with him. But underneath the humor was something his followers couldn't fully laugh off. Even a man who has preached faith healing for his entire adult life is still, in the end, an aging human body subject to the same biology as everyone else. Then, in March of 2026, something else notable happened. Copeland sat down for his first extended one-on-one interview in more than 15 years, a conversation that ran past the 2-hour mark with evangelical podcaster Bryce Crawford. It was a friendly, sympathetic setting, the kind of interview where nobody was going to press him on donor money or doctrine. Noticeably absent was any follow-up sit-down with Inside Edition, the outlet that had confronted him hardest in the past. The pattern was hard to miss. After years of being willing to face at least some outside scrutiny, Copeland now appears to only take questions from interviewers who have already agreed not to ask the hard ones. While all of this was playing out publicly, something bigger was happening behind the curtain, a slow, deliberate handoff of power within the family. John Copeland, Kenneth's son, had stepped down as chief operating officer back in 2018 in the middle of a very public divorce. For years afterward, he was kept at arm's length, listed only as a consultant to the ministry. But by 2025 and into 2026, John Copeland was back, this time as chief executive officer of the entire organization, according to records tracked by the watchdog group Ministry Watch. His return puts operational control of the ministry squarely back in the hands of the founding family. His older sister, Terry Copeland Pearsons, who already serves as senior pastor of Eagle Mountain International Church, has taken on an even bigger title, Chief Visionary Officer of the ministry as a whole. That's not a decorative title. It signals that whatever comes next for Kenneth Copeland Ministries, the direction is going to be set by his children, not by outside leadership or an independent board. And through all of it, Kenneth Copeland keeps repeating one of his most famous personal claims, that he has struck a private agreement with God allowing him to live to the age of 120. He's tied that promise to a specific date, December 6, 2056. And has told his congregation he's been planning ministry themes for individual years all the way out to 2029. Every birthday that passes, that promise gets talked about a little more, both by supporters who take it as a matter of faith and critics who see it as one more example of the ministry making promises reality has never been kind to. Behind the leadership reshuffling, The Copeland family has also quietly absorbed some devastating personal losses that sit uneasily next to the ministry's core teachings. In May of 2021, Kenneth and Gloria Copeland's great-grandson, a young boy named Clark Meyer, drowned. It was a devastating loss for any family, but especially painful for one that has spent decades teaching that speaking faith-filled words over your loved ones invites divine protection over their lives. And yet the ministry's response was almost total silence. There was no nationally broadcast memorial, no Sunday message addressing how a tragedy like this fits into a theology built around speaking prosperity and protection into existence. For an organization whose entire brand is built on the power of the spoken word, the absence of any public word at all felt conspicuous to a lot of longtime observers. 2 years later, in 2023, the family lost Marty Copeland, who had been the public face of the ministry's health and fitness offshoot for years, encouraging followers to honor God through physical wellness. By the time she passed away, she and John Copeland had already been divorced for roughly 5 years. Kenneth Copeland Ministries never issued a formal statement to its donor base about her death, and had barely registered in the wider press. Once again, questions quietly circulated among longtime followers about how the ministry's teachings on healing and long life squared with the reality unfolding inside its own family. Go back further, and you'll find more strain than the ministry has ever advertised from the pulpit. John Copeland's 2018 divorce didn't just end a marriage. It also ended his position as the assumed successor to his father, sidelining him from top leadership for years before his recent return. His sister Kelly Copeland, known to younger audiences as Commander Kelly from the ministry's Super Kid Academy children's programming, has also gone through more than one marriage. And Kenneth Copeland himself had 2 marriages end before he met Gloria, a chapter of his life you will not find mentioned anywhere on the ministry's official biography page. If the family drama has stayed mostly out of view, the ministry's finances have not, and nothing exposed that tension more than the ministry's relationship with private aviation. In 2019, Inside Edition correspondent Lisa Guerrero tracked Copeland down at a small private airfield in Branson, Missouri, to ask him directly about the fleet of aircraft his ministry had built up using donor funds, a Cessna Citation Bravo, a Cessna Citation X, and most strikingly, a Gulfstream V that Copeland had personally purchased from filmmaker Tyler Perry. According to reporting at the time from the Christian Post, the ministry was simultaneously asking supporters for an additional $19.5 million to upgrade the jets and build a new hangar to house them. Money solicited from everyday working-class donors who'd been told that giving sacrificially, even their last paycheck, could unlock a 100-fold financial blessing from God. The backstory made the confrontation even more pointed. Years earlier, Copeland had appeared on his own broadcast alongside fellow televangelist Jesse Duplantis and explained, half-joking, why neither of them flew commercial anymore. Getting into a long tube with a bunch of demons, as Copeland put it, was simply too dangerous. Duplantis laughed along in agreement. When Guerrero brought that clip up to Copeland's face at the airfield, he flatly denied ever saying it, despite the footage already being public and widely circulated. When she pressed him on whether using donor money to buy and maintain a private jet was appropriate, he told her it was none of her business, called her sweetheart and baby throughout the exchange, and at one point took her hand to pray over her instead of answering. It remains one of the most uncomfortable, most replayed moments of his public career. That wasn't Copeland's first brush with outside scrutiny, either. Back in November of 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, then the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, sent formal inquiry letters to 6 of the country's best-known televangelists, Copeland among them, alongside Benny Hinn, Joyce Meyer, Creflo Dollar, Eddie Long, and Paula and Randy White. Grassley wanted straightforward information: who sat on each ministry's board, what executives were paid, how much aircraft cost, and where financial records were kept. 3 of the 6 ministries cooperated. Copeland's was one of the 3 that didn't. Eagle Mountain International Church, the legal entity behind much of his ministry, responded that it had cooperated as much as it could without compromising privacy and associational rights under the Constitution, which in practice meant it refused to even name the 10 people sitting on its own board. despite a sitting U.S. Senator asking directly. When the Senate staff finally released its findings in January of 2011, some details did leak out regardless, including that the Copeland's parsonage outside Fort Worth was an 18,000-square-foot mansion appraised at $6.4 million on 25 acres of land. Those same instincts, bold declarations instead of transparency, showed up again during COVID. On March 29, 2020, Copeland appeared on camera, stretched out his hand toward the screen, and announced he was personally executing judgment on the virus, while also demanding a vaccine appear immediately. Days later he appeared again, blowing air toward the camera and claiming his breath was destroying the coronavirus. His wife Gloria had made her own headlines 2 years earlier, during one of the deadliest flu seasons in a decade, telling viewers that flu season is not real, and that Jesus had already given the world its flu shot. The CDC later estimated that roughly 52,000 Americans died during that flu season alone. Critics have long argued that statements like these, coming from people with such enormous reach, actively discourage viewers from seeking real medical care. Money and health claims are only part of the story, though. Many of Copeland's harshest critics argue the real issue sits underneath all of it, the theology that the ministry is built on in the first place. Copeland has long been one of the most recognizable voices of the Word of Faith movement, a strand of charismatic Christianity that traces back to a writer named E.W. Kenyon, who died in 1948. Kenyon's writings on faith, healing, and spiritual authority went on to heavily influence Kenneth Hagin Sr., who is widely credited as the movement's chief popularizer, and who personally mentored a young Kenneth Copeland in the late 1960s. After Copeland had already spent time working as Oral Roberts' personal pilot. Some people who grew up inside this world have since spoken out about where these teachings really came from. Costi Hinn, nephew of Benny Hinn, has written that much of what Hagin taught was lifted almost wholesale from Kenyon's earlier work, going so far as to call it plagiarism in his own writing. For critics, that raises an uncomfortable question. If the foundation of the movement's theology was borrowed and repackaged rather than built from careful biblical study, what does that say about everything constructed on top of it since? Two specific teachings, tied to Copeland, have drawn the sharpest criticism over the decades. The first is often labeled by critics as the little God doctrine. In a 1987 broadcast of Believer's Voice of Victory, Copeland said that whenever he reads in the Bible where God calls himself I am, he smiles and says he is too. And in one of his books he went further, writing that Adam wasn't just a little like God, but exactly like God. Pastor John MacArthur has called this teaching an entirely different gospel, and Hank Hanegraaff, known widely as the Bible Answer Man, argued in his book Christianity in Crisis that Copeland's ministry shows the characteristics of a cult. The second controversial teaching concerns what Copeland says happened after the crucifixion. According to his preaching, Christ's death on the cross wasn't enough on its own to secure salvation. Instead, Jesus descended into hell, was tortured there by Satan, and was effectively born again before defeating the devil in a spiritual battle. This teaching directly conflicts with a traditional Christian understanding of the atonement, and it has drawn criticism from respected theologians including the late R.C. Sproul, as well as ongoing pushback from apologist Justin Peters. The sermon laying out this teaching is still available through the ministry's own website. Critics tie all of this together into one argument. Once you accept that believers are functionally little gods, and that spoken words carry supernatural power, it is a short step to believing that giving money is itself a spiritual act capable of triggering supernatural financial returns, the exact belief that has, for decades, encouraged supporters to give sacrificially, sometimes to their own financial detriment, in hopes of a hundredfold blessing. Zoom out from the theology and the finances, and a broader pattern becomes hard to miss. Kenneth Copeland Ministries, by almost every visible measure, has been shrinking for years, even as its broadcasts carefully avoid drawing attention to it. The ministry's flagship program, Believer's Voice of Victory, stopped airing on the Trinity Broadcasting Network back in October of 2020, cutting off one of its largest and most reliable platforms for reaching new audiences. Conferences that used to stretch across nearly a full week have been trimmed down into much shorter, smaller events. The ministry's own private airport in Tarrant County, Texas, once a literal symbol of how far the operation had grown, is now down to a single usable runway. The finances tell a similar story. In 2021, the appraised value of the Copeland's well-known parsonage dropped by close to $4 million, a shift the watchdog group Trinity Foundation publicly flagged as suspicious. Independent evaluators haven't been kind to the ministry's transparency either. Ministry Watch currently gives Kenneth Copeland Ministries an F transparency grade and a donor confidence score of just 10 out of 100. Low enough that the organization's official recommendation to donors is simply withhold giving. Ministry Watch has also noted that more than 20 members of the extended Copeland family have drawn paychecks from the ministry over the years, adding another layer to ongoing questions about how leadership, compensation, and oversight actually work inside the organization. Meanwhile, Gloria Copeland's public presence has visibly faded. She appears on broadcasts far less often than she used to, and the ministry's social media has gradually shifted its language about her toward appreciation for her legacy and years of service, rather than her current active role, the kind of tone shift that often precedes an organization quietly preparing its audience for a transition. It's worth noting, too, that Copeland is far from the only aging leader in this particular movement. Oral Roberts died at 91. Kenneth Hagin Sr. died at 86. Paul Crouch, founder of the Trinity Broadcasting Network, died in 2013. Eddie Long died of cancer in 2016. Every single one of them led a ministry built partly on the promise of divine healing and long life, and not one of them came anywhere close to Copeland's stated goal of 120 years. As of December 2025, Kenneth Copeland turned 89 years old. He's still preaching, still appearing at events, and hasn't announced any plans to retire. But there's no getting around the fact that his public schedule today is a fraction of what it was in his prime, and that the interviews he now grants are almost exclusively with friendly hosts who've agreed in advance not to raise anything uncomfortable. None of this means Kenneth Copeland Ministries is about to collapse. The organization is still active, still broadcasting, and still reaching audiences around the world. But the signs of a slow structural shift are getting harder to explain away as coincidence. A shrinking broadcast footprint, a smaller physical campus, leadership quietly consolidating back into the hands of Copeland's own children, a health scare that put his own no-doctor's theology to the test, family tragedies the ministry chose not to address publicly, and independent watchdogs actively warning donors to hold onto their money. The bigger question isn't really whether Kenneth Copeland Ministries survives him. It's whether an organization this closely built around one man's personality, one man's voice, and one man's specific promises to his followers can hold its influence, its donor base, and its credibility once he's no longer the one standing at the pulpit. His own aging supporters are getting older right alongside him. The next generation of leadership is already stepping in quietly, without much fanfare from the stage. Whether that transition goes smoothly, or whether it exposes even more of the cracks that have been forming for years, is something only time, not a covenant with God, is going to answer. What do you think is really going on inside Kenneth Copeland Ministries? Let us know in the comments. And if you